Hey everyone, it's Bob, also known as DoggerQBones. Welcome to the very first video of our revitalized YouTube channel. We did have some content before on YouTube, but we never particularly kept up with it. But that's all changing today, because it's the first video where I'm going to be helming it, and I'm really excited to get into it. So what we're doing today is our very first video of my Improving at MTG series, which is going to be either talking about very crucial concepts to improving at the game or game reviews where I can go over gameplay of myself or somebody else, break down the thought processes, what went right, what went wrong, why, and analyze every single line, not to an insane degree, but enough that you understand why something was correct, because I don't believe there's a lot of content that actually does that. So I'm hoping this is really helpful. So without further ado, this is gameplay from my friend Mike. He is a very strong player. He's a constant mythic player. Don't let the gold fool you. Recently he's been busy. You stop playing for like a month or so, right? And your rank slips. But he is a very strong player, but I'm hoping to show you guys that even strong players can make a good amount of mistakes. He's playing my Orzhov Shadow list in Historic, which is one of my favorite decks right now. I think the deck is really good and just well positioned in general. So let's just get right into it. As we can see, forgot to mention, the guide will be below. So if you want to follow along with the deck so you know exactly what's in it, you could look at that. It's one card different, but it's just one portable hole in the sideboard. So no big deal. Anyway, let's take a look at this opening hand. So you could take a second to think, is this an opening hand I want against an unknown opponent, no companion? I think it's pretty obvious, yes. Let's get the video started. Pretty obvious, yes. You have lands, you have a few threats, you have interaction. Really not much else you can hope for. So he's talking it over. This was actually a coaching session, so some of his actions are delayed as he's explaining it to me. So Mountains to Skirk Prospector, we can probably safely assume that this is Goblins. So turn one, and Mike already has 4 decisions, right? Yeah, 4 full decisions. Actually 5, technically speaking, if he's debating on which land to play as well. So he could play Concealed Courtyard or Shafet Dunes. I think it's pretty obvious that you should play a Concealed Courtyard at this juncture. And then you can go for the Selfless Savior, Esper Sentinel, push the Skirk Prospector, or go for a Thoughtseize. So he mulls it over for a bit. He's talking it through. Selfless Savior at against Goblins, not really great. Some decks play Munitions Expert, but what are we protecting at this point, right? Could go Esper Sentinel, but they don't really play any non-creatures, really, for the most part, if any at all. So it's mostly just a 1-mana 1/1. You could Thoughtseize now, but Thoughtseize is really for Muxus, because that's the card that's going to kill you more often than not, right? So that really leaves you with the final line of just playing the Fatal Push. Now, whether you want to do it now or on their turn, some advantages to both. If they happen to accelerate into a 3 and you wait on your push like Mike chose to, that could be really awkward. But you can also deny them information, and maybe you actually want to push something else more, like a Conspicuous Snoop or something. So I agree with Mike's line to just wait. It seemed unlikely they're going to ramp it to a 3. Skirk Prospector is mostly for ramping it to 6, the Muxus. Not so much a 3, so they attack, pass, Mike pushes it. Everything's good so far. So next turn, obviously, he just has his Shafet Dunes, and I don't think there's a particularly hard decision here. You have 1/2 drop. You're probably just going to play it at this point. You could hypothetically go 1 drop into Thoughtseize, but as we just said, you're not really looking to Thoughtseize this early. You want to try to Thoughtseize as late as possible to grab the Muxus, as that's the most threatening card in their deck. So now something that Mike does, which is excellent, specifically for the Shadow decks, is that he knows he's going to play Daunto Vanguard. That's not a question. What he's considering now is whether or not he pays the 1 life. Because for Shadow, you want to get your life total relatively low, so you can either play the Death Shadow itself, or you can play the Scourge of the Skyclaves. He decides not to, figuring that, you know what, if I want to pay life, I can just use the pay 4 ability on Untitled Vanguard. It's really hard to say at this point in the game whether it's actually even a correct line or not, if paying the 1 life was better than not. But I think this is very reasonable, because if you're going to pay 4 life a lot of times, it's going to put you right now to 3 versus 2. And with double Infernal Grasp in hand, you may not want to pay too much life in the beginning. So not paying the life right now, I think, was definitely the correct line. So opponent's tanking. Just hanging out. We were afraid that they disconnected. They did not. They're just really thinking it over, which is good. I feel like a lot of players play too hastily, so really tanking over your line sometimes, when even you have a small decision, is great. They go for a Hobgoblin Bandit Lord, which is just, in this case, is just a 2/3 Lord. Has an activated ability, but we aren't particularly worried about that. Drew a land for turn, which is really nice. We weren't dead by any means if he didn't draw the land, but it definitely would have been pretty awkward having to play with just 2 mana for another turn. But now his decisions open up a lot more. So he correctly attacks before playing the land. Why give the opponent information when you don't have to? It's very small, but these small edges can make a big difference. If your opponent misplays because they have less information, then that's great. So it's deciding which side to put the land on. Generally, this deck wants more black mana than anything else, and you already have 2 white. So I'm assuming he's just going to put it on the black half. Now let's see what he does. So this is a really tough decision. And he's about to end the turn. Okay. So I would actually say, I'm pausing quickly, because that was his first very big mistake of the game. I guess not very big. Very big is a little much, but first mistake of the game for sure. So, Selfless Savior in the Goblins matchup just really does not do much. Furthermore, what are you protecting? An Untitled Vanguard that's already can protect itself by paying 4 life, which you're probably happy to do at this juncture because we're at 19. So Selfless Savior doesn't do too much right now. He correctly identified that he wants to play Infernal Grasp this turn. That's good. That's definitely what he wanted to do, but it's what the other 1-drop was. Selfless Savior does pretty much nothing, so we have to analyze the other 2 cards. Esper Sentinel also very likely does nothing. The problem is they don't really play non-creature spells. There is one potential non-creature spell they could play, though, and that's Ironcrag Feat. What Ironcrag Feat would allow them to do is on turn 4 they cast Ironcrag Feat and accelerate directly into a Muxus. So we have to consider that with our decisions this turn. We could go Thoughtseize. Maybe we could nab the Muxus out of their hand if they happen to be playing Ironcrag Feat. Maybe we even nab that or something else. Who knows, right? So we have 3 decisions, really. Because it's unlikely we're just going to go Infernal Grasp pass or we're going to go triple 1-drop this turn. So it's between which 1-drop do we want to play. So based on me saying that, it sounds like, oh, we should definitely Thoughtseize then, right? Because if they just go land Ironcrag Feat Muxus, we're probably going to lose. That's probably true if that does happen. However, a lot of the Goblins decks right now don't play Ironcrag Feat anymore. They can. Of course, we don't know exactly what list the opponent is playing. And it seems like they're the mono red version rather than the Rakdos version, which I don't think I've seen Ironcrag Feat in the Rakdos version yet, but I could be wrong. So it's really playing with your odds, right? So I would say for this turn that playing Selfless Savior was the worst of all the lines in terms of which 1-drop to choose, because it really doesn't do anything. If you played the Esper Sentinel at least, then if they happen to have Ironcrag Feat, you can draw a card off of it, and if they have a bad Muxus, hey, you're still in this game, right? And you got a card to boot. But if they go Feat into Muxus, and you just played Selfless Savior, well, you know, they have a great Muxus, you're dead regardless. If they have a bad Muxus, then you just lose out on a card. So the question is, do we Thoughtseize here? I say no. I don't think we should Thoughtseize here. As I said before, it just seems unlikely that they play Ironcrag Feat at this point. That's like older tech. I think people have evolved to just like having the really creature dense versions. For example, the Hobgoblin Bandit Lord. Uh, there wasn't much space in goblins already, so if you're adding these new creatures, you had to take out something, and most people took out the Feat. So I think it's pretty safe to say that they aren't playing Ironcrag Feat. So it seems pretty unnecessary to Thoughtseize at this point. However, we can hedge against it by playing the Esper Sentinel. However, on the flip side, you can also argue that, well, if we play the Selfless Saver right now and they play Goblin, try to ping the Untitled Vanguard, you don't have to pay for, which is true as well, but that seems relatively inconsequential when we're trying to lose a decent amount of life at this point in the game. So I believe Esper Sentinel is the correct play. And he's holding open the Infernal Grasp, which of course is correct. Seeing what they play, there's no reason to Infernal Grasp on your turn because the Hobgoblin Bandit Lord can't do anything special. Instant speed, its activated ability is only relevant if you cast another Goblin first. So goes for a second Hobgoblin Bandit Lord. Lets it resolve, which probably shouldn't have. If you're intending on Infernal Grasping, probably just should have killed it before. Like maybe they played a land and pinged. No, don't really give them the option. I think it's pretty small, but it's not really a big deal. So easy attack with the Adanto Vanguard. And now we actually have the same exact situation again, where Mike can play a 1-drop and hold open Infernal Grasp because he drew the third one. So now, which one do we go for? Do we go for the Thoughtseize or do we go for the Esper Sentinel? Well, if we're basing it off the same logic as we had last turn, because you're functionally in the same exact scenario, we should still go for the Esper Sentinel. It's still too early to go for the Thoughtseize. However, I believe Mike goes for the Thoughtseize here. Because I actually mentioned, well, there is a possibility of Ironcrag Feat. So I think I spooked him accidentally. And he decided to go for the Thoughtseize. He's really talking it over. And if you weren't sure, I did cut out the audio for this because didn't want it overlapping. So he goes for the Thoughtseize. Sees a pretty strong hand of Krenko, Chieftain, Muxus, Snoop. We could pause and talk about what he should take here, but there's really only two reasonable options. So you could take the Krenko, I guess, but with double Infernal Grasp, what are you realistically losing to, right? They draw lands, they draw they play out Muxus, they hit the nuts, they kill you, right? So I don't think there's too much consideration here. Just take the Muxus and don't worry about it. You have double Infernal Grasp for their Chieftain and their Krenko anyway, so seems to be in a really, really good spot if that Muxus doesn't come swinging. I think it was too early to cast the Thoughtseize, but you got what you wanted anyway, so kind of all worked out the same, right? Opponent finally finds the lands. They're tanking. Do they want to play Krenko, Snoop, Chieftain? Hard to say. All right, so they decide to go for Chieftain. That makes sense. They're probably trying to set up a Chieftain Krenko turn. So let's see what Mike does. And here, unfortunately, was a second very crucial mistake. One that, the biggest of the match probably, and one that almost cost him the game or the match. I forgot if this goes to 3 or not, to be honest. So we know that the opponent is setting up Chieftain Krenko. That's a really strong curve, and Shadow traditionally is not great at beating through small creatures, or at least not my list anyway, because I don't play Fairy Guide Mother or anything. So by killing the Hobgoblin Bandit Lord, now you're stuck in a really awkward scenario next turn. Because we know if the Chieftain lives, they're going to just play Krenko, and then what do? If we kill Chieftain, they get to keep their Krenko around, and that could potentially do something. If we kill Krenko, they can activate in response, get a Goblin. It's not the end of the world, but that's still pretty annoying considering we're trying to kill them as fast as possible, especially because they have a Snoop in hand that can help them recruit, get value. Can't think of the word that I was trying to say, but get value for them while they can stall with a good block, or just go lower, wait till we have a Death Shadow, then throw a 1/1 in front of it. Because we don't have an excess or removal in this deck. It's just 6 pieces, and we already drew half of them. And the other half are Fatal Pushes, which Selfless Savior can help enable, but that's a pretty not great line. So, unfortunately, going after Hobgoblin Bandit Lord is just going to put Mike in a super awkward situation, which we're going to see unfold. Furthermore, it allows them to attack for 2 if they wanted to. They decided not to. They probably should have. But Death Shadow here was an excellent draw. It's going to allow us to pressure a lot. Because all we have to do is pay 1 life with the Shafet Dunes if we want and just play it as a 1/1. We don't even have to decide to pay a bunch of life. But we could also just pay a bunch of life too if we want. We don't want to go any lower than like probably 5 at this juncture, because they have Ramanap Ruins and we have the Infernal Grasp. But you can make a pretty beefy Shadow. So that's probably our best possible draw at this point. Oh, also doing the Shafet Dunes now would be awkward because that actually doesn't work, because you have to hold up the Infernal Grasp, of course. So you have to pay the life with the Adanto, which he does correctly. And now, the opponent has no decision. So lets the Krenko resolve. So this says to me that, oh, you're going to kill the Krenko, which I believe is the correct line. I think you have to kill Krenko at this point. Mike, unfortunately, accidentally lets the trigger resolve, and he's like, wait, I was supposed to kill Krenko first. It's a brain fart. It happens, right? Everyone does it. So, still correctly, we don't want to compound our errors, goes after the Krenko. But now you're seeing this unfold that we're kind of in an awkward spot. So we have a 6/6, and we actually do have lethal, technically, if they let the Shadow through, but the opponent is savvy enough to probably not let the Shadow through. So they have a lot of time to stall. So, interesting enough, Mike is debating whether or not he should hold the Shadow back, decides to only attack with Danto, which is pretty interesting because you would think that, oh, you just want to start jamming Shadow because that's going to force a block. I believe he probably should have. I understand that there's a worry that maybe if the opponent finds another Krenko, they can kill Mike through some blockers because he's already pretty low, and then there's a Ramanap Ruins. They find another beefy creature, then they can just hit Mike for a lot and potentially just chump next turn. So I don't hate attacking with Adanto specifically. I just think it probably should have been paired with the Death Shadow. If you wanted to attack with Adanto, you attack with both. They have to chump the Shadow. You're probably getting 3 through. And then you still have a blocker, and you only die to Krenko specifically. Or I guess double Goblin. So if they draw like Landlord Snoop, that would also be awkward. So the best possible line at this juncture to play around the most is probably just attacking with Shadow. Attack with just Shadow, then they don't have great attacks anymore because they have to block 1. Even if they have double creature next turn, they can't swing out because you could just hypothetically double block Adanto and Selfless Savior onto the Chieftain. Maybe survive depending on the size of their goblins, but I guess if they have double, that wouldn't work. So you just have double chumps. But if they attack with too few creatures, then you have a huge Shadow, and they run the risk of dying to a removal spell. So it's definitely a tough attack. But I think just going for just Adanto is not great. Also, considering that we have 2 more creatures in hand to help soak up damage, attacking with both seemed better to me. So Mike actually lets it through. He does not pay the 4, which I also found pretty interesting. I think initially I thought that was incorrect, that he wanted the Adanto around, because we didn't want to be defensive. We wanted to be aggressive. So if you just use the Selfless Savior to save the Adanto, that seemed better. But reevaluating now, I think that's fine. And saving it for a defensive turn could actually work out a lot better, especially because Mike has 2 small blockers. So if they go for like a big attack, you could put the Selfless Savior under the biggest creature, double block something, and then like save one of your 1/1s or something like that. So I think it works out just fine. So opponent goes for Snoop, reveals Ringleader, which is really scary. It's not Muxus scary or Krenko scary, but it's still quite scary because that's going to recur. I keep saying recur. Accrue a lot of advantage, and produce more trumpers. You know, Mike is at 6. And only is going to take a few creatures or a bad attack to kill him here. So Mike drew Knight of the Ebon Legion for turn. He has the small decision point on whether or not he wants to just play the knight out or grab Luris. He's considering his odds and also how he wants to attack. So how he attacks too is also going to dictate his decision. He could hypothetically hold back, grab Luris. That's a pretty reasonable line. However, at this point, I believe he evaluates that he can't sit idly by anymore, especially because it's a ringleader on top. Maybe if it was a mountain, he could be a little more cautious, because it's like, all right, maybe they don't have anything, so I can just like set up and try to get to a higher life total. But that doesn't even seem like a great line anyway, because with Snoop, it's probably going to find the opponent another goblin eventually, and the problem is only going to be compounded the longer Mike waits. So this time he did the correct attack of Death Shadow and Adonto Vanguard, debating once again whether or not he wants to use the Savior to save the Adonto. At this juncture, especially because they're blocking with Snoop, I think you probably want to, because the 3-power attacker is likely to be relevant, and the opponent is conserving life so aggressively that you're going to need multiple creatures probably to kill them in one fell swoop. So, and then Mike correctly plays the Knight of the Ebon Legion. It's a shame that we can't pay for to put a counter on Knight, which is a line that's really fun to do with this deck, because we died to their Ramanap ruins. So we can't do that. They play Ringleader. Very scary, but thankfully they only hit 1 goblin, a few lands, and a Herald's Horn. So that worked out pretty well for Mike. Didn't get too punished. So knows about the Chieftain in hand. Draws a land. Doesn't really help too much here, but it's not awful because it's at least an if near dead lands, which could be really good at taking out a blocker if Mike happens to draw another land. So the question here is, how does Mike attack? You don't want to attack too much and not be able to kill the opponent and then die on the crackback, but you don't want to attack for too little damage either and then not be able to race effectively. However, let's see, does Mike do the correct attack? Let's find out. Come on, Mike. Is he going to do it? Okay, that's a very reasonable attack. So I think attacking with the Adonto as well was probably a bit better because you put them so low, and I don't really think beyond Krenko there's a combination of cards that kills Mike at this juncture. Because they have Chieftain, they play War Chief. Yeah, it has to be specifically Krenko, but I think you die to Krenko even if you don't attack and they block correctly. Because they just go War Chief, lands, Krenko. But pretty small edges. Like, there could have been scenarios where Adonto staying back actually saves him, so it's kind of a toss-up on which is better. Maybe just keeping it back is actually the correct line. I think it's so close, it's very hard to say. But either way, you wanted to be relatively aggressive with that attack. So Mike actually did happen to draw the second Deadlands, which is really nice because if the opponent gives up the Hobgoblin Bandit Lord in combat this turn, which they're almost certainly going to do, you can knock off the War Chief as well. So at this point, it's pretty clear unless the opponent's last card is a Muxus or a mountain to cast a Muxus, but I believe they did not play their land, so it has to be specifically Muxus for them to get back into this game. Mike's just analyzing how to attack. So now Mike attacks with the Adonto Vanguard. He knows that the Death Shadow block is forced, so he might as well get in a little bit of damage, which I agree. That is 100% the correct attack, because on the next turn, if they have one creature, you can just swing out, pump your Knight of the Ebon Legion, and since they're at 8, that's exactly 8 damage. So that's the perfect attack for that turn. And because Mike was patient, didn't show the if near deadlands, can kill off the war chief. Right now he's considering which desert to sacrifice. Doesn't matter too much, but decides for the if near deadlands, which I think is fine. So at this point, unless their hand is Mountain Muxus, they are just dead. Let's see what it is. Skirk Prospector. So it could also be 2 goblins to save them, but then they don't really have an avenue to win. So that's fine if it was 2 goblins to save them, because you just swing out, they're forced to double chump, and then they die the next turn, presumably. So Mike drew another land, can just if near that. And that's that. So Mike could have gotten really cute and paid 4 life just to, like, you know, do it, whatever. But they would actually have the Ramanap ruins available if you did it exactly like this, because you sack the goblin and throw it. Some people like doing the victory lap. I don't recommend it. A lot of people have died trying to do victory lap turns. So not my recommendation. And Mike cinches game 1. So the boarding here, I'm not going to spend as much time on, because you could find my tribal boarding in the sideboard guide. But Mike brings in the Witch's Vengeances, the Containment Priests, and the Hushbringers, which are all great. Takes out the Adanto Vanguards, a Selfless Savior, and the Esper Sentinels. Yep. Seems good to me. That's pretty much what you want to be doing. A lot of those creatures just aren't good in the tribal matchups. Okay. So, once again, we have a very solid hand. There's not terribly much to consider, because you have Hushbringer, which is one of your best creatures in this matchup, because it stops Muxus from just killing you. Luminarch Aspirant's fine. Death Shadow is fine. We have double deserts to help us get to the requisite life total, and we have a removal spell. Not much to consider here. He just takes it. Opponent's just tanking. I apologize, I can't skip ahead too easily. This is the video app and not like YouTube or something. I think a lot of the other videos I'll be getting will be on YouTube. I had to record this myself because Mike's PC is a potato. And this is the way I can display it. I guess I could have uploaded it to YouTube, but so much work. All right. Mike's considering. He has no 1-drop, so what does he do, right? Seems like an easy land pass. But there's actually a little more nuance to it than that. So Mike plays an if near deadlands, that's fine. However, you can take a point of damage if you want. You don't have to cast anything. You just take the point. So Mike considers at this point, well, do I actually want to take a point on their turn? And I believe he ends up doing so, which is the correct line. Considering how fast the opponent's start is, Skirk Prospector into Wily Goblin, you're probably going to want to deploy a Shadow earlier than later, because that's one of Goblin's scariest starts too. Just that's a turn 3 Muxus, and that is the nightmare. So I do remember that for whatever reason they're paused in their combat for a little bit, so I can skip ahead. Oh, skipped a little too far ahead. There we go. Okay, we saved each other like 20 seconds. Awesome. So Mike correctly takes the point of damage. Now you have a few options. You can Infernal Grasp the Skirk Prospector, or you just go for Hushbringer. Mike correctly goes for Hushbringer. Just cut off you can cut off the Muxus line both ways, but I think going for Hushbringer at least forces them to use a resource if they have it, because there's no way they can use a removal spell and cast Muxus. So if you know for sure you have to kill the Skirk Prospector, then you can. But I don't like doing it preemptively, because if their hand is just a bunch of lands in Muxus, then you might need those grasps later. Also, a small note, Mike took both points off the deserts. Once again, very good. Hushbringer is also going to help gain a few points of life, so Mike wants to aggressively get that life total down. Hushbringer and Death Shadow is a tiny bit of a nombo, but Hushbringer is just really, really good right now. So doesn't even seem to matter that much, as long as you're careful about it. So the opponent, interestingly enough, decides to attack with both, which is pretty crazy to me. I'm not sure where their head's at here. We're both talking about, like, what could they possibly have that makes this attack make sense, right? And we did not have a good answer. But you'll see why they attacked like this. Pausing in combat again for whatever reason. So I let the Prospector die. So what we were thinking at this point is like Chain Whirler, Goblin Chain Whirler. That would make sense at least. But they probably shouldn't have attacked the Skirk Prospector then, because why would you get rid of your better creature? Just attack with Wily Goblin, which we would have just taken. But if we made the mistake, blocked, they Chain Whirler us. That's a very... Oh, well, they can't because of Hushbringer. So that wouldn't even work. So all right, so I guess that's even off the table. But what it ended up being was Storm's Wrath, which we really did not expect. Which is even more confusing on why they bothered attacking, because they didn't actually get any damage through, and they lost their treasure for no value. So we were really, really confused at this point, but I guess their hand is just awful with a Hushbringer in play. That was Caps Lock during the game, and there it goes again. Amazing. So Mike doesn't really have a decision this turn. You can't proactively play any of the removal spells or Death Shadows, so just play Luminarch Aspirant. Simple enough. And see what they got. So, considering they Storm's Wrath on that board, Hushbringer was really messing them up, right? That's a consideration to make as they play Goblin Matron. So something you want to do when you're playing your matches is try to understand when your opponent does something, what they're trying to tell you, right? So they Storm's Wrath, and then they played a Matron. So we could tell for sure, okay, they were really, really reliant on this Matron for whatever reason. But weirdly enough, they actually missed their land. So if they were super reliant on the Matron, Mike correctly decides to take the point of damage again. If they're super reliant on the Matron, they're probably analyzing that, all right, the only way I'm winning this game now is through Muxus. So I need to find a Muxus immediately because I have like all lands, Storm's Wrath, and Matron, and that's what I'm going to do. It's not a cogent line from the opponent because you probably want to wait a little bit longer for the Storm's Wrath then. Maybe like turn 4, maybe Mike plays out more creatures, but I understand the logic they're going for. But they actually missed their land here. So they thought that the Hushbringer was that important they need to play Matron out now. But they also don't have lands. So what could they possibly have at this point, right? So initially, Mike drew the Thoughtseize, and of course, at this point, any player would be very curious on what the opponent has, because why are they making these lines, right? So they must have something. My first guess was a second Storm's Wrath. So they were giving up their resources to Storm's Wrath, hoping that Mike would overextend into the second one. That would make sense. Mike even said, so he didn't actually have the opportunity to do so, but I asked him, if you didn't draw Thoughtseize and you just drew like a random spell, what would you have done this turn? Or you drew a land, what would you have done this turn? And Mike said double Death Shadow, which, if we're inferring that maybe one of the possible reasons that the Goblin's opponent decided the Storm's Wrath, which felt very premature, it might be because there are multiple. So if that was the case, a double Death Shadow line would really get blown out, considering we have no other resources at that point. We have to grab Luris, and that's really awkward, especially if they start finding their land drops to work towards Muxes. It would be really too slow. However, Mike did draw the Thoughtseize, so makes his life a lot easier. Celebrating that he drew Thoughtseize, considering if he wants to do the Pain Land right now for it or not. Mike was very good with that, to constantly evaluate whether or not you want to lose life on your lands. If you're playing Death Shadow, you definitely want to be doing that, really no matter what format. In Historic especially, though, because you have less opportunity to lose life than you would in older formats. So weirdly enough, they did not have the second Storm's Wrath. They just have a hand of goblins. I guess what the opponent analyzed is that they couldn't really do anything as long as Hushbringer was on board, so they might as well just get rid of it instantly. They probably should have waited a turn, see if they can milk a little bit more value out of it, but if they wanted to I guess, try to go for Ringleader the next turn to get some value. And then they have a Matron. They're setting something up. So the Hushbringer was really hurting them. So I can't blame them for having to give up a few resources to kill it. That attack was not great on their part, and losing the treasure was also not great on their part because they were forced to just cast a Matron instead of Ringleader, which they probably would have preferred to do, or even Krenko, and just see if that works. But nevertheless. So Mike buffs up the Luminarch Aspirant, which is perfectly fine because the Shadow is going to get big enough on its own. Don't really have to worry about buffing it. And you want to diversify your power against a deck that can make multiple blockers. Opponent just runs out Krenko at this point, which seems fine. They are probably hoping that if the Krenko survives, then you can play Skirk Prospector, tap Krenko, get a bunch of little guys, pop one off, play Ringleader, so on and so forth. But unfortunately for them, Mike has double Infernal Grasp and Fatal Push even. So definitely not going to work out for them. So let's see what Mike does. Mike has a few decisions. We know for sure that that Mike is going to Infernal Grasp with the Krenko. Got to do it on your turn, right? You don't want to let them tap and get any value out of that. So Mike takes the damage. He wants the Shadow to be a little bit bigger. Makes perfect sense to me. At this point, Mike's life total is really in no jeopardy because they have just no creatures on board, and they're probably going to be forced to start chumping very soon. So Mike's just considering, do I want to shock myself? Do I want to put myself even lower? He does have another Infernal Grasp, but he does have to be a bit careful on how low he goes. He decides to shock himself with the Galdus Shrine and deploy the second Death Shadow. So that is technically incorrect. You don't want to present your opponent with more information when you just don't have to. Does it really matter? In this situation, no, but it's a good habit to get in the habit of. Why give the opponent information before combat when it's not relevant to combat, right? But anyway, Mike has double Shadows, Luminarch, pretty massive board, and the ability to pay even more life to make every attack lethal. The opponent plays a Ringleader, and this time is a full miss, which is very, very unfortunate. That is not what you want to see at this point in the game. So, as you can imagine, with double removal spell in hand and two huge attackers, Mike is able to cinch it. And we can just fast forward to that, 30 seconds. Oh, he even draws a Containment Priest for turn, just in case the opponent had any hope of winning. Really debating going for the victory lap, even dancing with it, but the opponent concedes. So, overall, I would say it was a pretty reasonably executed game from Mike. Definitely some relevant misplays, especially in the first game, where Mike Infernal grasped the Hobgoblin Bandit Lord over the Chieftain. But that just goes to show even great players can make pretty massive mistakes sometimes, and it can really cost you. You need to avoid those mistakes as much as you can. Anyway, that is the end of my first video. I hope you guys learned a lot. I want to be doing a lot of these, specifically the gameplay reviews, because I think they're super interesting. I actually have a lot of videos that members of my Discord are sending me, which I extremely appreciate. So we'll get to see a lot of different decks, a lot of different play styles, player skills, and you'll be able to parse out a lot of different scenarios with me. So I think that'll be super cool. Thank you, everybody, for watching, and I hope you have a great day.